awesome to be here at Google today. Believe it or not, this is my third talk at Google in the last 4 months. I spoke in London, and if you look at the video of London, I'm going to try and mix it up today so it's not a repeat of the London talk. And then in July, I was actually out at an offsite for the DoubleClick team in Portugal. Is anybody at that offsite? Okay, good. I always mix it up, but you will hear some of the same themes. But anyway, I spoke to about 500 of your colleagues because you have the benefit of working for the kind of company that is so forward-thinking that they see the approach that I am recommending to entrepreneurship as a really powerful tool for unlocking entrepreneurship within Google itself. And I think that's really fundamental to the message that I am going to share with you today. But Google also recognizes that in order to create great entrepreneurs, you have to give people great entrepreneurial experiences. And that means having people take charge of their own sort of journey, as it were, in entrepreneurship. And that's what the whole book is about. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm from the state of Maine, but I live about 5 blocks away on 12th and Washington, so I'm in the neighborhood. I probably see you guys around the hood once in a while. And I started my career, I came out of college and I started my career working in venture capital and private equity in Latin America. So even though I'm like the most gringo looking guy ever, I speak Spanish and Portuguese, and I basically in my early part of my career did a lot of early stage investing in Latin America. Then I went to business school. When I came out, I went to work in another private equity firm on Wall Street. Everything was great, moving up, no problems. And then 2008 came around and my company was AIG. And if any of you remember AIG, it was the company that basically was the face of the financial crisis. And my stock in the company, I had shares, fell 97% in the space of about 4 days. And I had this great epiphany that what I had been doing, that following this prescribed path, and I'd gone to Harvard Business School and done all the things that are supposed to be sort of no-brainers for moving ahead on the old ladder, hadn't worked out for me. And so that's how I came here today. So that's kind of my background, but what I'm kind of known for, at least among some of my friends, is, and by the way, here is my social media if you guys want to follow me, and we'll get back to this at the end, but if you're like one of those people who loves to tweet in live tweet events, feel free to do it. All the information's up there. So what I'm known for among some people is the person who invented FOMO, or fear of missing out. So I'm sure, how many people here have heard of fear of missing out? All right, how many people you'd like to say hashtag FOMO in their various social media? That's good. No, everybody's like, I'm not admitting to that, right? But when I was in grad school, I recognized this behavior among all my friends where people basically, they'd be like, yeah, like I'm gonna go to every single thing, every single night, and they would always be late or not show up to everything. And so I wrote this article in our school newspaper called Social Theory at HBS, McGinnis' Two Foes, and I had FOMO and FOBO, or fear of a better option. And so I wrote that article, and then, I moved on with my life, and then 10 years later, I got a call from a reporter who said, I'm doing this article about fear of missing out, and I've traced it back to you. And then some researcher at MIT wrote about it, and so on and so forth. So it's become my little calling card, which is really funny because I had this fear of missing out, I guess, but I didn't realize I was missing out on all these opportunities to integrate entrepreneurship in my career. I was very much the corporate guy. And so while I was the corporate guy, what I didn't realize, because I was kind of had my head down working, was that I was pretty, I was kind of disengaged in work. And I would show up to work every day, and I liked some days and not others, but I wasn't, I kind of just like went into the office, did the job, and never really thought about, what was my bigger purpose or what I could be doing outside of work. And a lot of Americans aren't that psyched about what they do. I mean, you work for Google, I've been in your cafeteria, I imagine that your level of happiness working here is pretty high. But the average American worker, and 70% of Americans are disengaged in what they do, and even prestigious paths, the jobs that we all were told were the right way to go when we were kids, like being a doctor or a lawyer or a banker, all those sorts of things, the average person these days is completely unhappy because of changes in pay, because of, there's an article today in Market Watch about the fact that Wall Street is just basically, because of robo-advisors and stuff, they're cutting all these people. So all of your friends from college who dressed up with a tie and carried a briefcase to class every day, all those people are finding that their industry has changed. And at the same time, you have lots of companies in tech that are no longer startups. Like when I think of Google, I still think of it as a startup, right? But it's not. It's a huge company, and so it has some of the downsides that big companies has. As much as this company is dynamic and offers you tremendous opportunities and is global. And I've been to a Google offsite and saw the various talent shows that were done. And so it's a fun place to work, but still there are going to be days where you come into the office and you're just punching the clock, right? At the same time, in the rest of the economy, you see this startup boom, right? And we've seen this. This is prolonged, right? In the last, since about, I'd say 2005, 2006, we've had a 10-year run where, like, despite the 2008 crisis, like, it kept going, right? I mean, we had major American companies disappearing, and yet the tech boom just kept going forward, and we've seen that has been, really amazing and sort of like a secular shift. Why is this? Why do we see this boom? The first thing is that the cost of starting a company has declined precipitously. And I have all of these companies that we all know up there that make the cost of launching your own business basically, what it costs to have a nice dinner in New York City. Squarespace is basically free. You can get a logo on 99 Designs. Thank you to Google. I mean, Google basically runs my entire life at this point for free. So, I mean, I subscribe to many things at Google, so I'm not a total freeloader, but it makes running a business basically free. Google Hangouts, Skype, all the things that we use. Carrying around your Android phone in your pocket. The first iPhone was introduced less than 10 years ago. So think about running a business on the side or doing something entrepreneurial 10 years ago versus today and how that's changed things, technology. And at the same time, the other big secular shift is the fact that financing of startups has changed so much. So when I started my career as a venture capitalist in 2000, I remember we would need to raise several $1 million just to get the site up and running, just to get everything up and going. These days, and I'm sure many of you who work in startups or are working on projects on the side know, you can basically launch a business for thousands of dollars, the low thousands, and get something up and going and an MVP. And thanks to Eric Ries and the Lean Startup, we all realize now the value of building something incrementally, testing it, and doing it in the cheapest way possible, right? So all of these things have happened. You have 300,000 angels in the US investing $24 billion a year in startups, right? But I think there's a downside to all of this, and I call it Entrepreneurship Inc. And Entrepreneurship Inc. is all of the people who glamorize entrepreneurship and make it sound like it's just super fun. It's like, oh, starting a startup is it's kind of like, it's a big party. It's going to be really attractive people there, well dressed and parties every night. And there are people who do. I mean, you guys know New York startup scene. There are people who literally just go out and drink with other startup people every night of the week, right? It's you can get trapped in that world. And I had this experience that for me was the light bulb experience around this Entrepreneurship Inc. thing. I was in Medellin, Colombia, which is now known as the most innovative city in the world. And I was talking to this young entrepreneur. He came up to me and he's like, Patrick, tengo una idea. I have this great idea and I want to tell you about it. I came up with it by hackathon. I live in Bogota. I'm going to drop out of college. I'm going to move to Medellin and I'm going to start this business. And I am ready to do this. So I was like, okay, lay it on me. What are you going to be doing that is justifying this pretty radical life shift? And he's like, Patrick, I want to start Tinder for dogs. And I was like, I was concerned, right? Because I really liked this kid. He seemed really earnest and he was this little preppy guy. And I just imagine him 3 months later, living on the side of the road in a bad part of Medellin, trying to get the startup going. And so, that kind of scared me. And it scared me that he thought that Tinder for dogs, and by the way, this has been launched, okay? This actually exists. I saw it in the Daily Mail. And there are a lot of happy dogs out there, okay? And so you come to this position where, the reality of entrepreneurship that is not being told is the fact that 75% of startups don't deliver the expected returns. And this is from a huge study done at Harvard Business School by Professor Shikhar Ghosh. And you also have this thing where there's a glamorization of failure, and people love to talk about their failure, and they love to talk about how great it was to fail and how now they've overcome it, because the bigger our failures, the bigger our successes. But Mark Andreessen, who I think is probably one of my favorite sort of thinkers in the space, has, he put it out there non-controversially, I think, that failure sucks, right? And so I want to give you today permission to accept the fact that it might not be right for you to be a full-time entrepreneur, at least for now. And there's 5 reasons, and the first is, this lifestyle question. Depending on where you are in your life, you may not be willing to make the sacrifices required to start a business. Living in the farthest part of Queens in order to pay your rent and have your startup, working all the time, the stress, the pressure, all the things that entrepreneurs must deal with. And we all know that entrepreneurs have higher rates of depression, of divorce, all those things. That may work for you if if you have family resources, or if you've sold a company and have money, or if you're right out of school, or you're in school, or whatever. It may not work for you if you're 32 and you're starting your family and you are trying to like pay the bills, right? Second is it can ruin your finances. So average startup founder in New York City makes between $50,000 and $75,000, right? So it's a tough, if you were working on Wall Street at Deutsche Bank and you made $500,000 a year, and then you cut down to $75,000, I've seen this happen with friends of mine. Like it's a hard transition, right? And it requires, you always hear about that founder who lived off their credit cards until they succeeded, and now they're killing it. You don't hear about the founder who just like never paid those off and is now living with his parents in Muskogee, right? The third is abandoning status and affirmation. So like you have that business card, you have the business class travel, you have the staying at the St. Regis kind of thing. People who jump into the startup world, where you don't have that support, where you're staying at the Budget Inn, where you're flying coach. I mean, that can be, I've seen, I personally lived that. It's hard, right? To go from the affirmation of saying, oh, I work at, XYU company, I work at Google, to, telling people where you work, and your parents are sort of like, yeah, like that's his little startup, right? It's tough. Fourth is you may not have the right idea yet. So 80% of people find their idea in their existing job or in a past job. So you just may not have gotten to your point in your career where you have figured out what you want to do. And finally, failure sucks, right? It's just no fun. And so what I want to do today is basically move on from this concept of entrepreneurship as an all or nothing proposition. And in fact, it is not. Entrepreneurship can be incremental, and I want to talk about that in the remainder of the talk. And what I've come up with, my solution to this, is what is called being a 10% entrepreneur. 10% entrepreneur is somebody who spends at least 10% of their time, and if possible their money, investing, advising, and getting involved with new ventures on the side. And I sort of came to this realization because I did it. After my whole debacle in AIG, I kind of had this, I was walking down the street one day, probably around here somewhere, and I was talking to a friend of mine who had done all these things on the side, and I thought, this is interesting because he's invested in all these businesses that, despite the fact that you have all this economic turmoil, he's diversified. They're all kind of continuing in their own way. There's real estate, there's startups, there's this, there's that. And no matter what happens, even if he worked at AIG, the day after AIG blew up, he would have something else. He'd still have something to put in his resume. He'd still have money coming in the door. He'd still have upside. And so I had this like revelation, but what I didn't want to do was just tell my story. And I spent 5 years kind of doing this myself and building up this portfolio that I have today of 20 companies. And we'll talk about some of those later. But I didn't want it just to be about like this dude, because everybody's different. And I wanted to show stories about people being 10% entrepreneurs all over the world. So I did a bunch of research, and I talked to over 40 10% entrepreneurs in 10 countries on 4 continents. And then I talked to people in many, many industries. So I had talked to people at Google. I talked to people at banks, and I talked to doctors, I talked to lawyers, I talked to car dealers, I talked to people who were stay-at-home moms or stay-at-home dads, I talked to people who worked at Facebook, all kinds of different things. And I built this sort of database, and I Michael Lewised it, which means that like if you ever read a Michael Lewis book, like I talked to all these amazing people, and then I tried to distill what they were doing and what I was doing into a message that I could share with you. And so what I learned from all of these conversations is there's really 5 really good reasons to be a 10% entrepreneur. The first one is the plan B, and I don't want to beat a dead horse. I mean, I think Google, I have a strong feeling will be around for a long time. But this is for all your friends who work on Wall Street or work in really unstable places. It gives you a plan B. If I had like the day of Brexit, all I could think was, if I didn't have my 10%, I would probably be freaking out right now. But I had been, when I thought to myself, thank God I built this portfolio, because Brexit, now I am diversified in a way that I wasn't 5 years ago. Brexit obviously hasn't been as big of an impact, but it really gave me like I used to not get out of bed the day that the market and stuff like that, I'd be so stressed out. The second is upside. And so I have built this portfolio, I've invested in a bunch of companies, and I have gained access to, working and investing in really great businesses. Companies that have become extremely valuable. And that gives me long-term upside that I could never have had working in a large company. The third, it makes your life richer and more interesting. And this is the one that I think a lot of people really get immediately, is just working on an entrepreneurial venture in a way that excites you, in the way that you can put your skills to work. It just makes life that much better, right? I would say more than 10% better. The fourth, you learn what it means to be an entrepreneur. So, so many people want to be entrepreneurs, but we don't necessarily know what it takes. Once you work on a new business, aside with people, getting involved, wrestling with the problems, and seeing the struggles of a startup, you get what it takes. So if you ever want to do it, you're not going in with this Pollyanna-ish kind of mindset that it's just going to be like a great time, right? It's going to be ups and it's going to be downs. And finally, you can bring it back to your day job. And this is really, this is for all of you here at Google, this is really in the DNA of Google, obviously. I don't know if you've heard Area 120 is a new venture capital firm inside of Google to invest in companies that all of you can start. Google gets the fact that great entrepreneurs make a great business, and I think this is something that will, some people say to me, oh, your job, this talk is, it's very anti-job, like you're encouraging people to leave. That's not what's happening. What I'm encouraging people to do is take responsibility for thinking like an entrepreneur, because I don't care if you work at Goldman Sachs or you work at the car dealership in Long Island, thinking like an entrepreneur is going to make you far more effective in your job. And so, I wrapped up all that analysis, and then I found this study that kind of puts the cherry on the top of the ice cream, which is that people who start entrepreneurial companies on the side while maintaining their day job are 50% more successful, or conversely 33% less likely to fail than people who start just straight in. Why is that? Two things. Number one, real option theory. The idea that, if you have an option that you've created, wait until you know it's in the money before you strike it. That's for all the finance people out there. But number two, put even more simply, when you launch a startup, unless you've got like unlimited resources, you basically start a time clock, right? It's like, okay, I have 6 months of money in the bank. I gotta raise money in the next 6 months. I need my idea to work. I need my MVP. I need to have this, that, and the other. You put a tremendous amount of pressure on yourself to deliver a certain number of outcomes in a certain amount of time. And so when you don't do that, when you actually wait for the thing to be financeable or to be self-sustainable before you jump in full time, you take that pressure off the table. Do you move a little more slowly? Yes. Do you make the whole thing more sustainable? Absolutely, right? And so what I want to move on to now is really to take you into how you do this, right? Like the back half of this is going to be, the 5 types of 10% entrepreneurs, and then it's going to be like how do you actually do this in real life. And we have the books in the back, which I'm delighted to sign at the end, and if you want to pick them up, they're at a highly subsidized price, I must say, which is awesome. And so just a little bit about the book. So I don't really read business books, but when when I got my deal with Penguin, what's really interesting, they send you like boxes of these books. So I have like my apartment, I've got like a whole like room of business books, right? And some of them are quite good and some of them are quite fluffy, naming no names, but I never really read business books because like I'm pretty inspired anyway. Like I'm a happy guy, like, but what I would find is I'd read these books and they'd be like 10 chapters worth of like inspiration, but very little how to actually do it. And so what I did in mine, and I hope you agree, and I'm hearing this back from people who read it in different places in the world, is that mine is very practical. Like I have 3 chapters of inspiration because everybody needs a little, and then I have 7 chapters of like how to do this. It's distilling all the things I've done as a 10% entrepreneur and as a venture capitalist into the book. And so I'm going to really get into that with you today. 5 types of 10% entrepreneurs. So the big sort of point here is that you don't have to choose just one, but you should start with one. And this is all going to relate to what you have sort of as resources, and we'll get into that a bit more, but I want to give you a couple of stories to show you how people are actually doing this. First one is Ipsy. Who here knows Ipsy? Anybody? Anybody here at YouTube that doesn't know Ipsy? Ipsy is a company that uses YouTube as a commerce platform. Founded by Michelle Phan, who is one of the biggest YouTube celebrities. She's got like 6 million subs at this point, 7 million subs. The company, basically, it's similar to Birchbox in that it sends out a monthly box, but it's doing far better than Birchbox. Sorry, Birchbox, but because YouTube allows it to basically have a 0 customer acquisition cost, right? So Ipsy was started by a friend of mine named Marcelo Camberos. He had worked with me, and I had worked with him on this business before that was using YouTube celebrities to drive clicks for different brands. So we had worked in this space, and we worked on it a while. It didn't really scale, but it was like a 10% for me. I learned about the space. Then he came to me and he said, I want to start this company, Ipsy, and I said, great, let me be an angel investor. And an angel investor is somebody who, and I'm sure all of you know this, invests their money in exchange for ownership in a business. So I invested in Ipsy, and and we'll talk about this later, but I knew the industry, I knew the founder, I understood the space, I got involved, and so I was the first investor in the company. And today the company has gone on to raise like $100 million. It's a really amazing business. If you don't know it, check it out. It's a great story about YouTube and about Google and the power that it has in the commerce world. And so, I have done since then a bunch more of these, and I have found that angel investing, it's one of those things that clearly there is risks involved, but if you understand the space, if you have a little excess capital to put, it can be a really interesting way to engage in an entrepreneurial venture as an investor. Second is the advisor. An advisor is somebody who trades their time rather than their money for ownership in a company, and I'm sure many of you are doing this. And the story I have here is for Silvercar, which is a really cool company if you don't know it, but it's kind of like the next generation version of auto rental cars for the airport. So the story here is there was a lawyer from New York City who was on a plane, and he met one of the founders of Silvercar. The business was going nowhere, and they needed advice. And it turned out the lawyer, Peter Barlow, was both a transportation lawyer and had also launched a business on the side in the car space. So he's like, I get this whole space, like from end to end. I get airports, I get cars. I'm a lawyer, like let me get involved. He gets involved, becomes a co-founder. This company has gone on to raise tens of millions of dollars. Audi's an investor. I mean, they're really killing it. Peter never left his day job, and now he has a really interesting founder share at a company that has raised a tremendous amount of money. It's doing very, very well and gives him upside he would never get in his corporate career. Third is the founder. So who here knows Luke's Lobster? Anybody? All right, good. There's one right here if you haven't been. So Luke is a friend of mine. We're both from Maine, and I met him, loved his lobster rolls, and I just like asked him for a beer one day. I was like, anything good coming out of Maine I want to know about. And he told me how he started this business. So he was working on Wall Street, 70, 80 hours a week. He realized that the lobster roll that all of us Mainers know from like eating, at a picnic table by the ocean had become this like high-end thing in New York City where like people are eating it with like a fork and knife and just totally messed up. And so, personally offensive, right? And so anyway, he decides he had been a lobster fisherman in the summer growing up. His dad had worked in the industry. He decides to scrounge together $30,000 with his dad, launch his first store, found a partner on Craigslist who could be there, who understood the space as well, who could be there when he wasn't able to because he was working full-time at this investment bank. And they paid back their initial investment in, I believe, 17 days. And then they opened another store about 6 months to a year later. And he only after the second store was up and running did he leave and go full-time. So he was a founder. He basically started this company, ran it on the side with a partner while keeping his day job. And then once he knew it was sustainable, he quit. And nowadays, Luke's Lobster has like 30 stores. You basically can't go anywhere without finding a Luke's Lobster. I eat there I have a rule, I have to eat there one time a week. Fourth, aficionado. So my buddy Dan Gertzikoff, he was the first employee at Google Colombia in Bogota. Classmate of mine from business school. Dan's one of those guys, those people who like Instagram all their food all the time? That's Dan. So he's the guy who like cooks things on Instagram them, like with a garnish and like it's plated. And I was in Bogota and he's like, I want you to come to this restaurant for dinner. Okay, so I meet him. Turns out he is an investor and advisor to the restaurant, and he cooks there whenever he wants. So he's an aficionado. Aficionado is somebody who's a 10% entrepreneur, but it's more than just like making money. It's really about like a passion project. They love to cook, so they want to be able to cook professionally on the weekends and be part of a restaurant to learn what it is. But he's not willing to give up like the tremendous opportunity of a Google to be a restaurateur, because if anybody's ever worked in a restaurant, like it's hard. Like you walk down the streets of New York, people are getting to their restaurant at like 7 in the morning to receive their shipment. I'm like, it just never stops, right? So he didn't want that. But he was able to, through his 10% entrepreneurship, engage in the restaurant sector in a way that meant a lot to him. Finally, 110% entrepreneur. Anybody here heard of Bluesmart? Bluesmart, the first intelligence, okay, great. So Bluesmart's a company that I'm actually an investor in. It's in my 10%. I'm an advisor as well. The founder of Bluesmart, Diego Saez-Gil, sold his first company. It was a travel startup. He was now at another startup that was slightly larger. And like once you're an entrepreneur, like you can't turn that off, right? Like even if you're acquired, it's not like you just stop being an entrepreneur. He had this idea for the first intelligent suitcase that you could control with your iPhone or your Android phone. And he ended up meeting another guy, bringing in a co-founder who understood manufacturing in China. They launched this business, put it on Indiegogo. All of us that were investors, we try to get our friends to buy it. Our goal was $50,000. The company raised $2.5 million. And now has gone through Y Combinator and now is doing millions of sales. It's in Bloomingdale's, it's in Selfridges, it's all over the place. So it's been a huge success. And Diego, after about a year, when he sort of figured out the business model worked, left full-time, he's now running the business. And so for him, being a 110% entrepreneur, which is a 10% entrepreneur that still thinks like a 10% entrepreneur, for him, that was a way to figure out his next startup. And in fact, he continues to do this. So he's on the advisor and investor in all kinds of travel companies in Latin America and the US, because as an entrepreneur full-time, he realizes, as we talked about earlier, that there is risk, that you are making a concentrated bet and you need to diversify yourself no matter what you do. And so with that, I'm going to move on for the next 15, 20 minutes, and then I'd love to take Q&A, and then we'll have time for signing. I want to move on to how you do this, right? What's the practical bit? Get into some of the nitty-gritty. And so the way that this is what I did, right? This is what I did, distilled into a slightly more organized, structured version, because when I did it, I was sort of like in the dark room feeling for the light switch. Number one is you figure out your resources. So all of us have different things that we can contribute. Maybe we have lots of money that we can invest. Maybe we don't. Maybe we have lots of time that we can invest. Maybe we don't. Maybe we have specific skills. Maybe you are a really great programmer. Maybe you can build an app. Maybe you understand marketing. Maybe you're a lawyer. Maybe you can build a financial model. Like, there's all these things that we're good at that we can contribute to entrepreneurial ventures. That's part one. Part two is your process. Like, how do you actually figure out whether or not you should engage in a particular venture, right? Because once you get going, and this takes a little while, but like now I get in a lot of inbound stuff coming at me, and I can't say yes to everything because, you know, number one, not all projects make sense or are good businesses. Number two, not all of them are going to be good for my reputation, right? And number three is like, I don't want to spread myself too thin. And the third one is your network. Your network is like the glue that makes every resource that you invest stick together and be more valuable. And so I want to talk first about resources. So the first thing is time. So I have had these really interesting, you know, the book is out there and it's cool. It's like coming out in 9 languages so far, and it's out in like the UK and the US and Latin America. So I talk to a lot of people, and I get like there's a couple pushbacks that I get, and the first one is time. So it's like, I'm too busy, and this came from somebody who was unemployed. They're like, I'm too busy, and I was like, wow, that's interesting. I'm too busy, right? I've got too much going on, and I give an example in the book of like the busiest person I've ever met who has like 10% on the side. But I'm busy too, I get it. But I also made some decisions, like I did an audit of my time, and I was like, man, like I spend like 3.5 hours a day on Facebook. Like, what's that giving me? You know, like what if I were to allocate half of that towards working on new ventures? I got rid of cable, like little things like that. Like there's all these things that you're doing that you don't realize. Think about the fact that you have a smartphone in your pocket. I know one 10% entrepreneur that takes her breaks, goes out into Madison Square Park, does her business, goes back in. I mean, these are things that you can do. We all have technology that enables us to be productive. So you can always find time. And if you find things that you're good at, like for example, if you understand programming, like what will take me an infinitesimal amount of time because I'm terrible at it, will take you about 20 minutes, right? So it just depends on how you engage, but you can find time, I promise you. Number two, financial capital. So, you know, sometimes, many times, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, you've gotten opportunities to invest. Investing may be something you want to do or not do. It may not be right for you right now. You may not have the risk tolerance. But I will say that it's amazing to me how low the entry point is for investing. I mean, I've invested as little as $5,000 in companies. I've invested more than that. But, you know, the cost of technology is so low nowadays that, for example, if you want to be a founder, you don't need that much money to get going. And if you want to raise money as a founder, you don't need to ask your friends or people who you think are interesting for that much money. So it really is quite accessible. And if you want to put more to work, I mean, you can do that. But there's a great story that kind of I've had companies come to me, well, our minimum's $100,000. And I'm like, well, that's a lot of money. Like, there's a great story about Dick Costolo, who was one of the investors in Twitter, who went on to be the CEO. When they came to him, I mean, the guy had sold his company Google, right? He had plenty of money. But they said, well, how much do you want to invest? Like 100, like 50, like what do you think? And he said, yeah, I think I'm going to go with 25,000. It's risky, you know, that's a good number for me. So $25,000, like not an outrageous amount of money. Like it's one that, you know, you could see yourself being able to save towards. That obviously went on to become worth millions of dollars when the company exited. Finally, intellectual capital. This is really like, what are you good at? So one thing that happens that's crazy is that I talk to really smart people because people say, well, I don't know what to do as a 10% entrepreneur. And I'm like, well, you're like a programmer at a startup, or you're like a designer and you make websites and they're beautiful, or you're working in high finance. You know how to build a financial model. What happens to us sometimes is we don't realize what we're good at anymore, right? And so, I'll talk about this a bit later, but your intellectual capital is the investment of knowledge that you can bring to the table. That's what makes all of these things sort of more impactful, is that all of us have specific skills and talents. And you should never just be thought of as a dollar sign for some startup. If you are, you're at the wrong company, the founder doesn't understand who you are, and you don't want to be there. And so how do you sort of do all this? As I spoke before, you got to leverage technology, and you've got to seek complementarity. You've got to find things that are leveraging what you're good at, where your skills are, where your interests are, because whether you're an investor, an advisor, or a founder, it is the skills that will get you success. It is the passion and the interest that'll keep you interested when it's boring or hard or uncomfortable. Second is setting up your family office. So even if you don't have the money today, set aside a little bit of your savings for your 10%. So that's what I did. When I started, I was like, this is how I did it. I said 10%. It feels substantial, like it's a real commitment, but it's doable. And it sort of comes back to like any of you who like are your churches or many different religions use the tithe. It's something that you can actually have an impact, but it's not gonna make you live a completely different life and have to move out of your apartment, right? And in fact, the average angel investor in the United States, according to the American Venture Capital Association, invests 10% of their resources in the new venture. So really the market clears in 10%. Finally, biography. So I talk about figuring out what you're good at. What I did, and what really moved the needle for me, and I've had a bunch of people who've done this come back to me and tell me this was so hard, like much harder than I would have thought, but actually it was very clarifying. You sit down and write an extensive bio of yourself, like starting like early on, and everything you've done, like be exhaustive, like make it, it should be several pages. And then through that, figure out what you're good at, what you like doing. You will see the threads, right, if you read your bio. And going through that exercise really helps you hone in on what you're good at, what you want to do, where you want to be. And then you have this great document you can use to figure out, sort of how you want to position yourself and pitch yourself to others. So once you've done all that thinking and you have some ideas about where you want to be, then, and we'll talk about how you find these ideas in a little bit, but let's assume you have some ideas on the table. How do you figure out what makes sense for you? So this is where you have to think like a venture capitalist. And in this part of the book, this is my longest chapter. It's pretty long. I talk about sort of how to approach ventures from the mindset of a venture capitalist, right? And there's really three things that I think about when I start a new venture. The first is the business. Like, does the business make sense? Is the business good? Does this market make sense? Like, is it attractive? Where will it be in 5 years? Who are the competitors? Like, all those due diligence points around, like, is this a great place to spend my time and energy from a business perspective? The second is the people. Whether you're a founder, an investor, an advisor, it's like, who are the people? Who do we need? The people that I have involved or that I'm backing, are they competent? Are they ethical, right? Are they good at sort of dealing with failure? Have they done this before? Is this their first venture? Like all of these things that you need to think about in terms of your potential partners. Because the partners, as anybody knows, new ventures, you can have a B idea and an A team very successful. You can have an A idea and a B team and like not so much. Finally, your role. And this is the one, number 1 and 2 are they're pretty self-evident. The third one I'd like to think is like a little bit secret sauce, which is that I only get involved in a venture where I can bring a client, bring an investor, tangibly add value, move the needle in one way or another. Why is that? Well, number 1, it's because it's selfish. If you aren't impacting a venture, say as an investor or as an advisor, people will not call you back. Like, you just became the name in the pitch book. They're like, they want to put your name with like a Google logo next to it to like get some credibility. When you actually do something tangible, it brings you opportunities to be more involved. Maybe you become sort of even more involved. Maybe you actually join the company someday. But the other thing is, if you can't do those things, I question whether you actually understand how the business works and you understand and know the people who are involved. And so that's for me is a litmus test. Like, I've had people come to me and they're like, with cool ideas, like the ideas that I'm like, that's a really terrific idea, kill it. But if I don't feel that I can move the needle Like, is it the highest and best use of my time? I say no. Finally, leveraging your network. So you can have, everything figured out in terms of how you want to look at deals. You can have everything figured out in terms of what you want to be doing and your resources. Now the thing you need to do is to find the deals, add value, and then make these things successful, right? And so this is where your network comes into play, because one thing I learned, I was that guy, and this is pretty sad, but I was that guy in college who would like read the chapters of the book that weren't assigned, because I was so afraid of failing out that I was like, well, I just need to know this chapter, I need everything, right? What I learned when I got to the working world is like, you should just find the person in your network or in the world that knows the right answer, call them up on the phone and learn from them, because you cannot know everything, right? You need to be in a continual process of reaching out to the world and engaging with the world around you. And so that's what 10% entrepreneurs do. 10% entrepreneurs are people who go out into the world, they talk to people, they explain what they're trying to do, and they find opportunities, because the great opportunities are maybe hidden under a rock. They don't just sort of show up on your doorstep, right? You need to go out and find them. And so we live in a city where there is no excuse. There is so much going on, as I said earlier. Like, you can go out drinking with startup people every night of the week if you want, right? But you work at a company that is a laboratory of entrepreneurship, right? Everywhere, I can guarantee, I won't ask the numbers, but many of you have ideas for companies in here. Many of you have friends from college that are doing things. There are all these resources that you can tap into in terms of sourcing. In terms of diligence, when you're trying to figure out, does this idea make sense? I have a couple things I do. I reach out to friends and people that I know. I also reach out to complete strangers. Like, if I were doing diligence on Luke's Lobster, I would walk around my neighborhood and ask people, like, what's the retail environment around here, right? People are happy. You need to get out into the real world, and people are generally happy to help you out, because entrepreneurs are people that are, by their DNA, open. They're sharers, they're helpers, they're people who want to help other people. That's what entrepreneurship is built on, is an open sort of culture. Finally, adding value. So I spend a lot of my time just finding great people I know to bring them into the companies I work with. So like, I have a friend who's in the book, Thomas. He was out of work, he was trying to figure out his stuff, and I put him into like 3 different 10% gigs with different companies that I knew. And because I knew he was really good at what he did, and I knew the companies needed help. And as an investor, not only do I want to make my companies more successful, but I want to build sort of like track record for me as a 10%, because it gets around. And I've actually had 2 companies in the last year, this is kind of like mind-blowing to me, come to me and say like, we just want to have you on our cap table. We're giving you stock. And I was sort of said, well, what do you want me to do? Because these were businesses I got. What do you want, an hour a month, 2 hours a month? Like, no, we just want you there, for like that one time a year when we need you. And like, they'll call me, with a big crisis or something. But once it gets out there that you're impactful and that you can add value to companies, like, you will not fault for opportunities. So it really builds on itself. So I want to leave you with 4 sort of critical principles that are, I think, takeaways that will help you as you do this. The first is always play to your strengths. Again, think about what you're good at. Get involved in those things, because the more sort of efficient and successful and sort of capable you are in an area, the more efficiently you'll work, the more likely you will sort of connect with things that create future opportunities for you, and the higher your chance of success. Second, put your day job first and always act with integrity. So your day job is the thing that gives you the stable platform to do all of this stuff, right? So be respectful. Don't ever use your corporate card to buy something for your 10% business. Don't ever make a photocopy at the office for your 10%. Like, really create a dividing line, because not only is just good policy, but it's about respect. And I think, all of the people in my book, and like, this was a policy I had straight away, everybody in the book has their full name in there, because I didn't want this to be about hiding and skulking around the back of the office. No, these are all people who are doing these things. And in fact, their companies are excited about them doing it because they see the benefits that it brings into the corporate environment. Third, this is long-term strategy. So I promise you no get-rich-quick scheme. I'm not a believer in those things. So like, I cannot tell you that if you work 3 to 4 hours a week that somehow you're going to be able to live a fabulous life and never work again. Some people will do that. I won't. This is something that takes years. It can be quick, but the average startup from Series A to exit takes 7 years. So this is something you're going to be doing. And in fact, there's a guy in the book named Steve Siegel, who's the head of global brokerage for one of the CBRE, which is a big real estate company. And this is a guy who's been doing his 10% for like 50 years. So he's an investor in Hale and Hardy Soup or Chopped or one of those. He's an investor in PJ Clark's. He's an investor in a minor league baseball team. He's an investor in a gazillion buildings. And this is a guy that hasn't left his job, but has this portfolio, of over 100 investments. And like, it's pretty amazing, right? Like, he's generating all this upside for himself, but he loves his job. He's never going to leave it. But he is known, like, around town. If you look him up, if you Google the guy, it's all about, how he did PJ Clark's with like all these other illustrious people, and how he with George Steinbrenner, and he's created this whole lifestyle for himself. It's really cool. Finally, this is all about mindset. So there are I can give you, I could sit here for 5 minutes and tell you all the reasons not to, and I've heard them all. Like, I've heard them all. Everybody comes to me like, why they can't do this. And I really tried to take that on sort of in a very direct way in the book by finding all these different examples of people who have plenty of reasons not to, but have done. And so I'm really convinced that the biggest barrier to entrepreneurship nowadays, given the fact that the cost of entrepreneurship has gone down, that it's so accessible, and we have technology literally everywhere we go, and all of these great services, the real barrier is mindset. And the thing is about 10% entrepreneurship is that this is so sort of like incremental, like it's just 10% to start. And so even if you fail, it's an experimentation more than anything, right? And so if you are afraid, and many of us are, and this is a great way to start, engage, get going, without having to sort of throw everything into one basket and run with it. And so with that, here's my info. So I live in the neighborhood, and I work in the neighborhood, and I have all these ways you can reach me. And if you speak Spanish, you can read El Emprendedor 10%, which came out recently. And so with that, I'd like to, I think, open it up to Q&A. So, and feel free to ask me. You can tell me I'm totally wrong. I want to hear it. And I think there's mics. Hi.
Oh, hi. Hello. Oh, thanks for coming, Patrick. I have a question on the how do you measure the risks? Because so in 2011, I was in kind of in a boat where I didn't have any kids. Now I have two houses and like too much to do. But in 2011, I was going to a New York Tech meetup. Right, I went there like 3-4 times. Squarespace was a startup then. They gave a presentation, and I thought, oh, that's complete bogus. That would go down there. Already so many websites. I thought a company like Aereo, they did like TV on an antenna, pick it up. I want that. I want to be part of that. So I talked at length with those guys. And I worked at Amazon then, so I had some like, what am I bringing to it? So I thought like, oh, it's not too hard. Like, I talked with Vine folks, they were using AWS. I thought, oh, yeah, I know that all that stuff. You use DynamoDB there, don't use that shit that's going on SSD now. And they thought, all right, so you know this stuff, and bring something to it. My predictions were completely off. Like, right, all right, what happened to Aereo? When I look back, oh, I'm so glad I didn't do like my 10% thing there, because they got into a legal case. They were completely shut down. And Squarespace going, what is going on with Squarespace? Why is it going up? And there are already websites creating stuff, like they were already like overcrowded stuff, marketplace there. So yeah, I was wrong. And stocks have been like more like less wrong as compared to there. So I stuck there, thinking through where Mobileye would go up, and then my career has been like, all right, Amazon, Facebook, Google, be with big companies,
right,
and dabble in there. But so yeah, now looking back, so when you meet those people and you kind of start predicting, what's the clue there? The people, role, sure, business, but you got all that. What about the legal cases? What about like the whole picture? How would things be in 5 years, 10 years? No idea, right?
Yeah.
Sure. So can you tell me something about that?
Very good question. Thank you for it. So you're right. You can never know. You look at like even the smartest venture capitalists out there, and they have major mistakes either with the things they don't do or the things they do, right? So entrepreneurial ventures by their nature are risky and they're volatile, and you never quite know what's going to happen. Whereas the stock market, like, the level of volatility is much lower, right? Even, 2008 as an exception, companies don't tend to disappear, right? So the way that I think about that personally is, number one, I do as much diligence as I can, but I accept the fact that some of them are going to fail, and so I limit my risks in a particular business. And if it's really risky, I'll be an advisor rather than investor if the company is willing to do that, and then perhaps see how things go, and then have the option value to invest a bit later when the company's a bit de-risked. I've done that, but I think it comes down to diversification. If you really think about what this book is saying, and I've done this personally, I have 20 different ventures, I have 14 or 15 tech, I have 4 or 5 real estate, and I invested in a play in the West End in London, The Last King of Scotland, which comes out next year, so if you're over there, check it out. For me, The Last King of Scotland is super risky. It's the play, I knew some things about it, but it's a really out there thing, but I'm so diversified at this point, I can afford to take those risks, and I do it in a limited fashion. So that, I think, is really critical, is to sit down, and I do this in the book. I take you through sort of how to look at your financial portfolio and your life portfolio and think about mitigating risk and diversifying risk. I think that's the way to think about that entire solution, because you just never know. Thanks. Hi.
Hi, I'm Jenna. Thanks for coming. So as you probably know, often investors such as VCs want to see that as a founder, you're all in. And so how do you convince an investor to put skin in the game if you're only 10% in?
Yeah. So this is interesting, because what's so funny about this is so many of the iconic companies that we know were started by 10% entrepreneurs, like Apple, right? They were working at HP. It was started in a cubicle. Everybody likes to tell that garage story, and all the companies buy their garages and kit them out, but those are mostly fictional. And so, I think the thing is, if you can use 10% entrepreneurship to get an idea to a stage where it is relatively sort of you have better data, and you have sort of some good use cases, and you have a good MVP, and you can do it that way, and then start raising money when it's at the point where you're prepared to leave, it's understandable that an investor would want you to be all in. I get it, and I think I would be the same way, and I am the same way. But the 10% part allows you to build up the foundation for the business in a way that when you go to investors, you have a lot more, and that allows you to get better terms, get a better valuation, all the things that you want to do. So you have to give up less to the company, because at the end of the day, what is fundraising but it's an exercise in control, or lack thereof. And so what I've seen, Ipsy is a great example. Marcelo, he started that while he was working at Funny or Die on the side. And then when he went out to raise money and go into a full-time, he had a very cooked case with a Google engineer who had been doing it at his 10%. We had a whole site up. So his pre-money, which is not, I can't disclose, but was pretty damn good. And he was able to raise money in really favorable terms. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So one general question, many companies, especially tech companies, have specific rules around, and even contracts around intellectual property.
Yes.
What you can do even in your own time. And I was wondering if you have either, thought about or addressed in your book the right way to go about approaching that. What are the pros and cons to different things?
Yes, it's a good question, and it's one that it's been interesting, because I expected this to be the #1 pushback on the book when I was thinking about it, and because I had come from the Wall Street side where there's all these trading rules and all this sort of stuff, and there's all this compliance stuff that's going on. And what has been interesting is actually it's been less of a question from people. And as I interviewed people and talked to different people, very few people were hiding or had to deal with issues at their work. But I do think, no matter what you do, if you have an employment contract, you must respect that full on. You must have a view on how you're going to sort of address that going in. And I encourage people to be very open about the fact they're doing this, because, the reality is very few companies these days treat you like an indentured servant. The world has changed dramatically, especially in technology. And so, Google, for example, the fact that they've had me speak 3 times in 6 months tells you exactly where your company's at. But I do think that, you need to take the time to invest, to look at your contracts, because you don't want to get into a situation where, and I've seen this happen, everything's great one day until they decide they want to, your company decides that they want to terminate you, and then all of a sudden, they start digging up all of the stuff that you've been doing, right? So I draw a really bright line there, and I encourage you to do the same.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi.
Hey there, thanks for being here. So my family happens to be from Medellin in Colombia.
Oh.
And so I was very curious to hear your opinion as to what has turned that city into an innovation mecca and what kind of things you're seeing coming out of there.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the reason why I go to Medellin is, aunque parezca muy gringo, hablo español, and even though I look very gringo, I speak Spanish. And I'm on the board of a group called Social Atom there, which is a seed stage venture firm that's based in Medellin, and I'm happy to introduce you to them. Actually, they're doing really great things, and the reason why they've changed things, I mean, number one, Colombia has gone through this peace process, which is controversial. Some people are more in favor than others, but there is obviously just a huge, I remember when I was in investment banking in Latin America, one of the charts in the pitch book was like number of kidnappings per year and number of murders per year, that tells you what you need to know about Colombia, right? That has totally reversed. Number two is Medellin, Colombia is probably the finest example I can think of a city that has its ducks in line. They have created a sovereign wealth fund from the city, which the money, they get 7% of the profits from epiphany, which is the utilities company, to invest. So they've built this tech campus in the middle of a old part of the city that's kind of rough. They have built this tech campus. They have a space for foreign companies to come in. They have invested in venture capital. They're investing in engineers. So they've created this whole ecosystem out of scratch that is really paying off. And I'm certain, I can guarantee that they would be really excited to meet you, the people that I know. So afterwards we can connect, and I'd love to introduce you. Cool. Hi.
Thank you so much for coming. My question was very much along the same lines of when you work at a big company, especially something like Google that is involved in so many spaces, and then you try and, on the side, maybe create something, not being competitive with your 90% employer, I guess. Have you seen, I guess along those same lines, have you ever seen an employer take ownership of a company after an employee has left to maybe do full-time? And if so, like, what are the mistakes that person made that the success stories haven't?
Yes. Yeah. So I'll give you another way to think about this that your question sort of made me think about, which is there are some companies that are going to just be like, they're going to be extraordinarily restrictive, right? And what I tell people in that situation is, first of all, I think that's terrible because it's such a yesterday way of looking at the world, frankly. It's just completely ignoring reality. But second of all is, it may be that you can find ways, for example, I talk about playing to your strengths a lot because I want people to be successful, but playing to your strengths can be done in a way that doesn't necessarily compete with your business. For example, as an aficionado, investing in that restaurant like Dan did. Like, Dan worked at Google. He understood how to use the web to drive consumers to a product. He understood how to use social media to build awareness of a business. He didn't invest in something that was directly competing with his employer, but he leveraged all the skills he had to make that venture more successful. And you can do that especially if you're in finance or design or building apps, you can do that all day long in ways that will never compete with your employer. In terms of a company actually taking an idea, I have not seen that yet. That question's a really good one, and I'm going to try to find some examples because I do want to hear it. But what I found, at least in my research, was in general, the people that I profiled had already put it out there and were very comfortable, and their employers were supportive. And the people who didn't want to say, I had this one crazy story that I couldn't put in. This guy worked for the Koch brothers, everybody's favorite, and he had this business on the side that was extraordinarily, he's making more money on the side than he was. And he had in Silicon Valley, they have their separate life. He had a whole office in his car to be able to do stuff during the day. And I just was like, dude, that's crazy. I could never endorse that to people, but I think those are the risky ones. The day he gets up and he's like, yeah, so take this job and, I'm done. And then all of a sudden, they could ask for, people usually leave signs of the things they've been doing. There's always a way to find, these days, data is never secure anymore. So they could go after him, request his personal laptop, things like that. There's ways. So that's why it's so dangerous. But I don't have anything that I found in my own research.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hey.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. Do you have any tactics on how to keep it at 10%, not allowing them to take over your day-to-day job? Because I guess you get very passionate about the project, and
yes.
I was wondering, do you have any hands on that?
Good question. Okay, so this is kind of the converse of this one is, how do you know when to go all in, right? And that I think about this. So there is a point where if it's going well, it could definitely start requiring more of your time, right? So the ways to keep it at 10% are A, if you become an advisor, as an advisor, I always just sit down and I say, like, this is how much time I can give. This is what we build like expectations, and we build a contract around that, so we have a very clear arrangement. As an angel investor, you can spend as little or as much time as you want. It's the founder where it gets tricky, because the founder, you're an active player in this business. You are pushing it forward every day. And so what happens there is you will get to a point where you have to make a decision. Like, do I want to continue to scale this? And if I do, it demands more than 10% or 20% or something sustainable. Am I going to go full-time or not? So if you want to limit it to 10% and continue to grow, you need to bring in partners. You look for a co-founder. If you want to be in the middle, and I have a great story in the book of a woman named Polly who started a company called Masala Baby that's here in New York City. She went to her employer and said, I want to do this. I'm going to open up an office down the hall in our space in Soho. I'm going to give you 2.5 days a week. I'm going to give my company 2.5 days a week. And she did that for 3 years, until now she just went full-time on her own business, because it's the opportunity so massive for her that, like, it doesn't make sense to work for somebody else. But, you know, in this day and age, what's cool is that companies, like, it's hard to find good people, right? So if you're doing a great job at your employer, I have been surprised at how many of the people I've talked to are able to negotiate a day or two a week. Like, there's an assistant at McKinsey in London who I have on my blog. She started a candle company. McKinsey allows her to work from home out of her home candle studio in Wimbledon 1 day a week, because she needs to receive deliveries. And so so there's all these ways to either keep it to 10% or make it 20, but in a way that's sustainable to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a great fan of the whole 10% entrepreneurship concept.
Thank you.
It seems kind of hard to, like, find other people who feel similarly. I feel like a lot of people either they don't want to put in serious work outside of work, they don't want to put in work time outside of work, or if you go to, like, more serious entrepreneurship events, people want to go all in, they want to, like, quit their job, start doing this full time.
Yeah.
How do you suggest finding other people who also feel similarly about doing this 10% concept?
Yes, good question. That's really on me, isn't it? Like, I've got to build a community around this, and I'm trying to do that. But I think, you know, we're early on in this. What I always thought when I was working on this is, like, this is so I got a lot of pushback. A lot of people in the beginning were like, this idea is, you know, why? Like, why are you doing this? Like, it's not going to work, whatever. And then as I built the research and met all these people, I was able to build a case for it. And now I get a lot of emails and other communications of people who their minds have been changed about how they think about entrepreneurship. So I think it will only increase. But my encouragement to you is, you know, the hardest thing as a 10% entrepreneur, and I struggled with this for like 2 years until I figured out how to do it, was be able to explain what I wanted to do, how I wanted to do it, why, and who I was looking to work with. And once I did that, once I got my story straight, I found it was a lot easier to actually convince people. Because a lot of times what happens when we don't get our story straight on, and I talk about this in the book actually, how to do this, is that people just don't get it. They're like, who is this guy? Like, what, I don't get it. If you can explain to people in a very pithy way how you want to engage as a 10% entrepreneur, it makes the whole thing a lot easier.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think that's about time, but I think Patrick did say he has some further time for book signings if you have a couple questions.
I brought my special signing pen if anybody wants.
So thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.